part 2 of color perception. I'm coming back to these reflectance curves to remind you that what we're seeing as colors or hues, it is selective reflectance, or what is reflected off of whatever objects we're looking at. Those wavelengths that are being reflected into our eyes, while other wavelengths are being absorbed by the object. And we can distinguish this or contrast this with selective transmission, where some wavelengths are passing through an object or substance, or some wavelengths are being allowed to pass through when there's some transparency to those objects or substances. So liquids, plastics, glass, sea glass, or glass that's been softened by the ocean. It's one of the reasons I think it's so beautiful. It's been softened and it has this selective transmission through it. It's really quite beautiful. But every time we're drinking orange juice or cranberry juice, that those liquids are allowing certain wavelengths to pass through and other wavelengths are not passing through. And as we talk about color vision, it's a good time to also come back to the fact, right, that we have our rods and we have our cones. And our rods are giving us that nighttime vision, and they are really responding maximally around 500 nanometers. And so I don't know if I talked about the Purkinje shift before, but the Purkinje shift is really cool to watch as we get into nighttime. So in the daytime, in daylight, we have a lot of medium and long wavelength cones, and they are doing most of the job of seeing. And so the brightest kind of distinction that we see is between yellow and red. But then as we get just into dusk, where we are using our rods as much as we are using our cones, but we still have some amount of color vision because the cones are kind of still involved, but the rods are in there, what we start to really see as the biggest distinction, or the clearest distinction as kind of brightness and contrast, is the blue-green distinction. And I'm a big fan of blue. Blue and purple are my favorite colors. I like green too, so that the trees kind of popping out from the sky and all of that is one of my favorite times of the day. But the other thing we talked about was our cones giving us our color vision, because we have these 3 different kinds of cones that are responding to different wavelengths of light. And so that's what's giving us our color vision that we have, our range of color vision. We have those short wavelength cones responding maximally at about 419 nanometers, the medium wavelength cones responding maximally at about 531 nanometers, and the long wavelength cones responding maximally at about 558 nanometers. And if you think about, if you kind of draw a line going through, at yellow, the long wavelength cones are going to be responding more than the medium wavelength cones. And so it's that relative response. If we move into green, then we see that the medium wavelength cones are responding more than the long wavelength cones that are responding more than the short wavelength cones that are responding a tiny bit. And so it's those relative firing rates of those different cones that tell us about, again, the wavelengths that are out in the environment. Nervous system processes this to give us our experience of color. A good distinction to make, or an important distinction to make, is between subtractive color mixing and additive color mixing. And I know when the first time I taught about this with subtractive color mixing, it was at Midlands Technical College at night school, and they were saying, hey, you're calling my teachers liars, because they were saying we're adding. You're adding paints or crayons to each other. So if you add 2 paints together, like blue and yellow, and you get green, we'll talk about why blue and yellow make green. Or really, you can see this is cyan and yellow, so certain blue and yellow are going to make green. This is subtractive color mixing, not because you're not adding something, but because what's happening is you are subtracting out wavelength values. There are certain wavelength values that are not being reflected anymore. And in fact, both the cyan and the yellow are continuing to absorb or subtract out the wavelengths that they were subtracting out in the first place to give us that original color. So the book has a really great example that if you use this example for explanation, it's perfect because it's perfect. It's a great example. So if I'm mixing blue paint, that cyan paint that's reflecting short and medium wavelengths, and I mix yellow paint that are reflecting medium and long wavelengths, the blue paint is absorbing the long wavelengths, the yellow paint is absorbing the short wavelengths, and so when we mix them together, we're going to continue to absorb the short wavelengths because of the blue, and the short wavelengths because of the yellow, and the long wavelengths because of the blue. And so the only thing that's being reflected still is the green. And you can see that it's probably going to be a little bit darker, right, than just green paint. When we're mixing those together, we're really seeing where those two things are coming together to do some reflectance. So subtractive color mixing, typically when we mix things, they get darker and darker. As opposed to additive color mixing, where the best example is theater lights. And if you can get two lights that have some kind of something that transmits some wavelengths through the light, but light is going through that. And so you overlap one light. In this case, we can use yellow and blue. If I'm giving a yellow light and I overlap it with a blue light, then the yellow is going to continue to reflect. They're going to continue to reflect what they were reflecting before. Neither one of them is absorbing, right? Because what we're doing is they are lights. And so the yellow is reflecting the long and medium wavelengths. The blue is reflecting the short wavelengths, and those get added so that short, medium, and long wavelengths are all being reflected, and we end up with a white. This is also what is really happening in TV when we have those kind of pixels or computer screens with those little pixels. Pointillism, tapestries, where now there are different cones across the eye that are responding to different little dots or points, and the mix is occurring really in the mind. It's always the nervous system that is giving us our interpretation of light, but at this point that mixture is happening in the mind. And I'm going to take us back through this example from the textbook, because these pictures and examples from the textbook are really excellent. So if my blue light is reflecting short wavelengths, my yellow light is reflecting medium and long wavelengths, and then we overlap those lights, we end up with the short and medium and long wavelengths all being reflected, and so we end up with white. So being reflected across the electromagnetic spectrum. I've taken this example from Dr. Robin Morris, who taught this class for a really long time and taught me when I was your age. And so we can see this is pointillism, and we can see that there are some dark dots. Pointillism is basically I'm just using little tiny dots to create my painting. And this is kind of pulling us off of this painting, so it's hard to see some of those dark dots, but when we close up onto it, you can see that even on her face, which is really quite light in the previous picture, there are some dark purple dots. So what's happening when you move away from that is you're stimulating different cones that are right next to each other, and the mix is happening in the mind. And that's what is meant by the mix is in the mind. Some tapestries really work this way as well, that there are some huge tapestries that were made as something to hang on a wall, not something to step on. And if you walk farther and farther away from them, they kind of brighten up, and you can really kind of see that they have these pictures in them that you can't see very well when you're right on top of them or right next to them. And they're much darker when you're right on top of them or right next to them. And then I added this a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat, who was painted between 1884 and 1886. And I used to think, wow, did they not know exactly when that was painted? But I am betting it took him 2 years to do it, or that he started sometime in 84 and ended sometime in 86. So if you see this, this is at the Art Institution, the Art Institute in Chicago, and it's shown in Ferris Bueller's Day Off in that movie, and they close up on the little boy's face, the little boy who's kind of close to the water, but sort of in the front, right after you get out of the shadow, and you can see his face gets darker and darker, and there's an expression on it. But here, as again, I've made it small because it's easier to kind of make it small. As you pull off of that, you just see this. It's very, very light, because you're again seeing all those different dots, but they're mixing. Those colors are mixing in your mind, and so you have all of this reflection. All of this reflection of these different wavelengths is going to turn into white. And I'm going to really briefly go back through these concepts of selective reflectance versus selective transmission and subtractive color mixing versus additive color mixing. They both happen in both of those. So both subtractive color mixing and additive color mixing can occur in both of those, selective reflectance or in selective transmission. And so remember that if I'm an object and I'm reflecting back some wavelengths and absorbing some, that's selective reflectance. But if I'm a liquid or plastic or glass or something where the light is being transmitted through, that's allowing certain wavelengths to be transmitted through. Usually in class, I do this thing with, and you can pause it if you want, but I'm guessing people haven't really been pausing this and doing these, especially something more kind of hands-on like this. But I would have little bottles of water, and I'd have people pass around food coloring and try to make certain colors with the food coloring. And what often happens, many people end up with this brown, icky mix. And so, and then they go to add yellow or something, and it really just makes it darker. And so at the end of it, we look at some colors, have asked people to share the colors. And then I ask them, so is it selective reflectance or selective transmission? And every once in a while people answer correctly, but a lot of times people say it's selective reflectance, but it's actually, right, we're looking at liquids, and so it's selective transmission. It's what's being transmitted through that liquid. Is it subtractive color mixing or additive color mixing? And I think because you're adding these food colorings, people think it's additive, but again, it's subtractive. As you add more yellow, it's going to get darker. You add a little bit of blue to make the yellow and green, but then you add just a tiny bit of red, it's going to end up this brown, icky, and you add something else, it's just going to get darker and darker because you're letting fewer and fewer wavelengths really transmit through there. But go look at things, make guesses, ask questions if you're not sure which of those concepts you're addressing, if you're mixing paints or food coloring or lights or on pointillist pictures or whatever. And in the book, they do this little tiny bit of history that is really fascinating and fun. Sir Isaac Newton told us a lot about a lot of physics and physiology and so forth. And some of the points that he made about light and color, one of the things he made sure to kind of hit upon is this distinction between the physical characteristics of light and the fact that, again, this is a psychological phenomenon. We are experiencing those physical characteristics, but we want to distinguish that and realize that this is because of our three cones and because of the inner workings of our nervous system of how we're interpreting that color. And so, or that wavelength, or those wavelengths. And we point to the same thing and say, hey, that looks like red, but we've all learned to point to those colors, right, or those wavelengths and call them red, but whether or not we are experiencing the same red is not exactly clear. And if we think about people who have some kind of color deficiency, as we'll talk about color deficiency because I'm missing a cone, or now they've discovered that there are some tetrachromatic females who have a father who has an anomalous trichromacy, so they have their long and medium wavelength cones are overlapping in a different way than quote normal, and then they have a quote normal mother, and so they end up with three of the medium long wavelength cones, and so they are actually distinguishing more colors than the rest of us. I know I am not one of those, as again, color is not a strength for me, and oftentimes I don't see as many colors. I've taken little tests. I don't see as many colors as most people. So color itself is not a property of the wavelength. It's the brain's way of informing us which wavelengths are present. And so how Isaac Newton discovered this and talked about this, at the time they really thought that those prisms or that rainbows, that what was happening was that those were adding these light components, these different colors, to sunlight or to white light. And what Newton said was, no, white light, sunlight, is made up of those different wavelengths of light, or those different what we could experience as hues or colors. And he proved this by letting light go in through a prism and then having this little cardboard thing with holes cut out so that each of those wavelengths, so each of those single wavelengths would go back, and he'd send it through a second prism. And you can see when it's being sent through so the longer wavelengths are being sent through the second prism, we get red and we have less of a refraction than if we go down to prism 4, so we're getting blue. That blue light is going through a particular hole and going through another prism, and it's being refracted or bent more than the longer wavelengths. And so it's clear that not only is the white light made up of these components, but that these components are the base, right? That there's nothing, that they're fundamental and they are the base, and that they have different properties. The fact that they're being bent differently or refracted differently shows that they have different properties.